Florida is one of the largest and most active rental markets in the entire country, and the state gives landlords broad freedom to set and raise rent. The governing law is the Florida Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Florida statutes. Chapter 83, Part 2. And while it establishes clear procedural requirements, it places no restrictions on the amount a landlord can charge. If you manage rental property in Florida, you operate in a firmly pro-market environment, but the notice requirements and practical realities of this competitive market still demand attention. Florida does not have rent control or rent stabilization under normal circumstances. There is no state statute that caps rent increases, limits the frequency of increases, or requires landlords to obtain government approval before raising rent. Florida's political and regulatory philosophy strongly favors property rights and market-based pricing. However, Florida's rent control framework has an unusual feature. The state constitution and statutes allow for temporary rent control during a declared housing emergency. Under Florida Statute Section 125.0103, a county or municipality can impose temporary rent controls if the governor declares a state of emergency that creates a housing emergency within the jurisdiction. The local government can then enact a temporary rent control ordinance for the duration of the emergency, but only for a limited period and under specific conditions. This emergency rent control provision has been invoked in the past during hurricanes and other natural disasters that displaced large numbers of residents and created extreme pressure on the remaining housing stock. After major hurricanes, some Florida counties have temporarily activated emergency rent control to prevent price gouging on rental housing. However, these measures are temporary, limited in scope, and expire when the emergency declaration is lifted. Outside of declared emergencies, Florida's preemption is clear. No local government can enact, maintain, or enforce rent control under normal circumstances. Under Section 166.043, municipalities cannot adopt an ordinance, resolution, or other measure that imposes rent controls on the amount of rent charged for residential property. This means Miami, Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, Fort Lauderdale, and every other Florida municipality are barred from implementing rent caps during normal conditions. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Florida requires at least 15 days written notice before the end of the monthly period. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver the notice by April 15th at the latest. Florida's 15-day notice period is one of the shorter rent increase notice periods in the country, consistent with the state's landlord-friendly approach. However, the lease can require a longer notice period, and many Florida leases do specify 30 days or more. Always check what your lease says before relying on the statutory minimum. The notice should be in writing and should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. Florida doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, but a clear written notice delivered by a documented method is always recommended. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term unless the lease includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. Common mid-term adjustment provisions include escalation clauses, provisions tied to property tax increases, or insurance premium changes, and CPI-based formulas. Given Florida's volatile property insurance market, where premiums have skyrocketed in recent years, many landlords are now including insurance-related escalation clauses in their leases to address this specific cost driver. When a fixed-term lease approaches expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rent well in advance. If the tenant agrees, a new lease is executed at the new rate. If the tenant doesn't agree, the lease expires at its natural end. If the tenant stays and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement subject to the 15-day notice requirement. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period is 7 days before the end of the weekly period. For quarter-to-quarter tenancies, 30 days notice is required. For year-to-year tenancies, 60 days notice is required. Florida's statute is specific about matching notice periods to tenancy types. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even without rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Florida has a specific anti-retaliation provision under Section 83.64 that prohibits landlords from discriminatorily raising rent in retaliation for a tenant exercising any right under the Landlord-Tenant Act. Protected activities include complaining about habitability issues, contacting code enforcement, filing a fair housing complaint, and exercising any right under Chapter 83. Florida's anti-retaliation provision uses the word discriminatorily, meaning the landlord cannot single out a specific tenant for a rent increase as punishment for exercising their rights while treating other similarly situated tenants differently. If all tenants receive comparable increases, the retaliation argument is much weaker. But if one tenant files a code complaint and then receives a 20% increase while every other tenant receives 3%, the inference of retaliation is strong. If a court finds that a rent increase was retaliatory, the tenant can recover damages and attorney's fees. The finding also undermines the landlord's credibility in any related proceedings. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Florida Fair Housing Act, found in Florida statutes, Chapter 760, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. The Florida Commission on Human Relations investigates fair housing complaints and can take enforcement action. Some Florida cities and counties have enacted local human rights ordinances that provide broader protections. Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and several cities have enacted protections based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and in some cases, source of income. Landlords in these jurisdictions must comply with both state and local anti-discrimination requirements. From a practical standpoint, Florida has one of the largest, most diverse, and most dynamic rental markets in the United States. The state's population growth, driven by domestic migration from higher tax, higher cost states, international immigration, and a strong tourism economy, has fueled extraordinary rental demand and significant rent increases across most major markets. South Florida, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties is one of the most expensive and competitive rental markets in the country. Miami's international gateway status, financial sector, technology growth, art and culture scene, and lifestyle appeal have driven intense demand. Miami experienced some of the most dramatic rent increases in the nation during the recent growth period, with some neighborhoods seeing 30 to 40% increases in a single year. While the market has moderated somewhat as new construction has added supply, South Florida rents remain extremely high by national standards. The Miami market has a significant international component. Foreign buyers and renters from Latin America, Europe, and other regions contribute to demand. The condo rental market in Miami is enormous, with thousands of individually owned condominiums rented through the traditional long-term market. Landlords who rent condos must comply with both the Landlord-Tenant Act and their condominium association's rules regarding rentals. Fort Lauderdale and the Broward County market have similar dynamics to Miami, but at somewhat lower price points. Palm Beach County, including West Palm Beach, Boca Raton, and Delray Beach, has a market driven by wealth management, healthcare, and a growing corporate presence. Central Florida, the Orlando and Tampa metro areas, has seen enormous growth. Orlando's economy is anchored by tourism, Walt Disney World, Universal Studios, and dozens of other attractions, along with healthcare, technology, defense, including the Naval Air Warfare Center at Orlando and Patrick Space Force Base, and a booming logistics sector. The Orlando market has experienced significant rent increases driven by population growth and limited supply relative to demand. Tampa, including St. Petersburg and Clearwater, has been one of the fastest growing markets in the country. Tampa's economy is driven by healthcare, including Moffitt Cancer Center, financial services, including USAA and Raymond James, technology, and the port. Rents in the Tampa Bay area increased dramatically during the recent growth period and remain elevated. Jacksonville, Florida's largest city by area, has a growing rental market driven by military, Naval Station Mayport, and Naval Air Station Jacksonville, healthcare, logistics, and financial services. Jacksonville is more affordable than South Florida or Tampa, which has attracted migration from higher-cost Florida markets. Landlords in Jacksonville have reliable pricing power with moderate annual increases. The Space Coast, including Melbourne, Titusville, and Cocoa Beach, has seen growth driven by the revitalized Kennedy Space Center, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and other space industry employers. Patrick Space Force Base adds military demand. The rental market has tightened considerably as space industry employment has expanded. Southwest Florida, including Naples, Fort Myers, and Cape Coral, has a market driven by retirees, tourism, and seasonal residents. The area was severely affected by Hurricane Ian in 2022, which destroyed or damaged thousands of housing units. The rebuilding process has affected both supply and demand, and rents have reflected the reduced housing stock. Landlords in Southwest Florida should be aware of the ongoing recovery dynamics and the potential for future storm impacts. The Panhandle, including Pensacola, Fort Walton Beach, and Panama City, has military-influenced markets near Naval Air Station Pensacola, Eglin Air Force Base, Hurlburt Field, and Tyndall Air Force Base. These installations drive significant rental demand, and BAH rates directly affect pricing. Panama City was devastated by Hurricane Michael in 2018 and has been in an extended recovery period. Gainesville, home to the University of Florida, has a student-driven rental market where demand follows the academic calendar. Tallahassee, the state capital and home to Florida State University and Florida A&M University, has a market driven by state government and education. One best practice for Florida landlords: factor insurance costs into your rent increase strategy. Florida's property insurance market has been in crisis, with premiums doubling or tripling for many property owners in recent years. These cost increases are a legitimate and well-documented business justification for rent increases. When communicating a rent increase to tenants, referencing the specific insurance premium increase, while not legally required, helps tenants understand why the rent is going up and reduces resistance. Another best practice: given Florida's vulnerability to hurricanes, build storm risk into your financial planning. A major hurricane can disrupt your rental income for weeks or months, damage or destroy your property, and temporarily reshape the local market. Maintaining adequate insurance, building cash reserves, and having a disaster plan protects your investment. Implementing moderate, consistent annual increases, rather than keeping rent flat and then imposing a large catch-up increase, helps ensure that your revenue keeps pace with your rising costs, including insurance, in a sustainable way. For landlords in markets with significant new construction, including much of South Florida, Orlando, and Tampa, monitor the competitive landscape carefully. New apartment communities with modern amenities compete directly with existing rental stock, and your pricing must reflect this competition. If new construction in your submarket has increased vacancy rates, adjusting your increase expectations accordingly helps maintain occupancy. Florida also has specific provisions regarding rent increases in manufactured home communities under Chapter 723. Landlords who own or manage manufactured home parks must follow specific notice and procedural requirements for lot rent increases, including providing 90 days written notice and specific content requirements. These rules are significantly more detailed than the general residential provisions. For Florida landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units. Submit increase requests well in advance. Florida requires landlords to return the security deposit within 15 days if no deductions are being made, or within 30 days if the landlord intends to claim deductions. The landlord must send written notice of intent to impose a claim by certified mail within 30 days. Failure to do so results in forfeiture of the right to make any deductions. While these rules don't directly regulate rent increases, Florida's detailed deposit procedures require careful attention whenever a tenancy changes. For the complete guide to Florida rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our landlord tenant law series.